Still a bit behind the screens at the moment, but I wanted to get this one about the Canberra done and dusted, because it's a very important story, and one that not many people know these days. You ask any kids in the street, or even some of their teachers, about the Falklands War, and they will tell you, well, they won't tell you, they'll look at you blankly and say, what? Falklands War 1982. Why did it happen? And what part did a white, ageing British passenger liner play in its success? The reason for the war was because a complete and utter Burke by the name of Leopoldo Galtieri, I don't know how to pronounce it properly, who was sort of a dictator, president of Argentina, whatever you want to call it. He had a problem. The inflation was running at 1,000%. People in the streets weren't getting fed. Unemployment was off the board. And he was in fear of a coup. And his great idea was, let's take back the Falklands. There's always been rows about it for years, who it belongs to. But of course it's British. He thought if he attacked the Falklands without any warning, they would then force Britain to come to the negotiating table, and they can stretch it out for years as to who gets this prime piece of real estate. And he forgot one little thing. A quite short, not overly attractive woman by the name of Maggie Thatcher, Prime Minister at the time. When she heard, she said, right, get all the troops together, let's go. Now, let me pack my handbag. Or words to that effect. Now, the main troop ship was going to be the Canberra. She was cruising, or had been cruising, in Australia. Now, she's a turbo-electric vessel, which is very complicated, but in layman's terms, which I have to use because I'm the layman that doesn't understand all this stuff, the drive came from two huge armatures attached to the shafts themselves, and one of them burnt out whilst it was down here. Now, this is a British shipyard job, really. No expertise. Well, it had never been attempted down here before. She limped around her last cruise on one engine, but then had to head for the UK. And that was not a good thing to be doing. Not on one screw, anyway. So what happened was, there was a company in Sydney by the name of Broom Brothers. They also at the time serviced all the Sydney Harbour ferries and stuff. And this company was excellent. They were the best. I knew Don and Walter quite well, the two elder brothers who actually worked themselves quite a bit on it. And they were given the problem. So over the next 3 weeks, I think it was, they hand wound miles and miles and miles, enough to stretch across Australia almost, copper wire onto the armature. Now, this is after it was all decoupled and, let's just say, tricky stuff. Now, you have to remember they were doing this by hand. Usually huge machines do it. It had to be in relays because they could never take the tension off the wire. One little gap between the wire and the one next to it could cause a spark which could blow the whole thing again. Anyway, they got it done, and she sailed for England. It was just a patch job. It wasn't meant to last at all. So halfway, well no, 3/4 of the way back to the UK, Galtieri and his Argentinian thugs invaded the Falklands, and they took it quite easily. I think there were only about 25 troops or something on the island, and the rest were all shepherds and farmers and just going about their duty. Now, they needed Canberra for a troop ship, so she speeded up there and got back to England a little bit early, not much. She got alongside, and within 24 hours they had 2,000 passengers off. I forget how many thousand troops, say 5 on. All the stores loaded by hand. A heliport fixed above the aft swimming pool, which had to be shored up then, not just down to the bottom of the swimming pool, but the deck below. All this was done in 24 hours. Troops, supplies, ammunition, ordnance I should say, although the ordnance was going to be quite large later on. And these troops were good. These were paras and commandos, and off she sailed, still with the patch on. Now this ship, she sailed from the UK down to the Falkland Islands. A convoy had already set out with other supplies and part troops, just as many as they could fit on board, helicopters, and HMS Invincible, which was a small through-deck aircraft carrier, angle deck rather, and she carried mainly Harrier vertical takeoff and landing planes. But of course the amount she had carried was way outnumbered by the Argentinians. Now all the way down our fingers were crossed, and I don't think I got too much sleep because I knew what the chances were of that thing actually getting there, but she got there. And there was a lot of milling around for a month or so, and they got some stuff ashore, and then troops started going. There was a second British ship there. It was called the Queen Elizabeth II, but she never went into San Carlos. She never landed troops. The troops, she stayed well out at sea. The troops were moved in on any form of landing craft they could find, and some even transferred to the Canberra and then ashore, because they didn't want the Argentinians to sink a ship with the name of Queen Elizabeth. Canberra was fine. She was expendable. Who cared about Canberra? Nobody, except the troops on her, of course. This was how things went for quite some while. Now naturally, the Argentinians got a little bit thingy about the Canberra being there, and the other escort ships and cargo ships and the Ranger and a few of the others. And they were constantly coming over with their MiGs or daggers or whatever they called the things. They changed the name slightly, bombing the living daylights out of the water between the ships, but very seldom hit anything. Now imagine the Canberra. She was sitting dead in the water in San Carlos Sound. It's white, it's big, it can't manoeuvre, it's landing troops and taking on wounded. She got hit with cannon fire from the planes, but all the bombs missed. Now the crew of the Canberra was the P&O crew. Every one of them volunteered to go with her because they knew the ship. From the engineers to the pursers to the waiters to the tankies to you name it. Only one man didn't go, and that wasn't his fault. He was the chief storekeeper, and the poor bugger was from Southern Ireland, and as Southern Ireland wasn't at war with Argentina, he couldn't go. Bit of a shame that, still. He was the only one. We also came under threat from what was really a World War II cruiser called the Belgrano, and the Argies tried to get a little bit smart-ass. The English had put an exclusion around the islands, so this thing went in and would cross the line and then nip out and cross the line and nip out, and she might have been old, but she was carrying some pretty hefty guns. It was a thorn in the side to what was going on. So the word was relayed to London, and Maggie Thatcher was given the briefing, and asked what she thought. Half the cabinet wanted to leave her alone because she was in and out of the restricted zone. The other half wanted to sink her. Maggie Thatcher just looked up from her desk and turned round and said, "Sink her." There was a British submarine in the water. Wasn't carrying atomic torpedoes, but very new conventional ones. Her name was HMS Conqueror. She overhauled where they thought the Belgrano would be and just propped, and sure enough the Belgrano was turning again. So 2 torpedoes put a stop to that, and it sank, and it broke up very quickly. Terrible loss of life. I won't say it shouldn't have happened, it had to happen. But it's the fortunes of war, isn't it? So she went down, and the Argentinians started to lose a bit of, what will I say, enthusiasm for the whole thing, which must have scared the living daylights out of Gattileri. Now, Belgrano sunk by Conqueror. One thing out of the way. She should not have sunk, but her crew weren't that good, and it just got totally out of control. So the war went on, and I put a photograph in here of a few of the troops crossing the tundra, because most of them had to march across the island. They were still trying to get the heavy weapons in, the tanks and the armour cars and stuff, and so they marched. And the picture that I've included of from behind one soldier, the radio man, with the Union flag flying from his aerial. Now you notice I said the Union flag. That's because that's what it's called. It's only called a Union Jack when it's being flown from the jackstaff at the bow of a ship. Real name is the Union flag. And there's a second photograph that I've put beside it of the Royal Marine Museum, and the statue outside you will recognise instantly. Gattileri thought that his claim to fame became his demise, and he was ousted straight away. He was lucky he wasn't strung up. He had to go into protection from his own people. The Argentinian troops he sent down there were a mixed bag. Some were elite troops, but the others were just conscripts, taken out of their houses, thrown into a uniform, had a rifle shoved in their hand, and sent to the Falklands to defend it. And of course, they weren't very happy. They were hungry. They had no beef against England. They'd probably never even heard of the Falklands. It was just the ambition of one man trying to stay in power. Another ship that was down there was the Uganda. Now the Uganda was British India, which is part of P&O, and as a matter of fact I have sailed in her, not when she was like this of course. She became a hospital ship for both sides, but mainly for the Argentine troops. Now there was one problem. She was a ship that ran the India to UK run under the British India flag, which is under the P&O flag, and they didn't have all the gear to dress the medical staff on board. A good friend of mine, a purser, who was usually in the P&O ships sailing the South Pacific, lovely bloke, sense of humour so dry that you had to have a drink of water whilst he told his jokes. But he told one, very seriously, that when the Argentine wounded were being brought on board, they were trying to jump off their stretchers and into the water, and they couldn't work out why, and it was because the medical staff at the time were saving their operating gear and all the rest of it. They were all wearing the standard butcher's aprons. I don't know if you remember them. They were sort of black, I think, with a white stripe on them. And they all thought they were going to be slaughtered and used for food. Anyway, that was soon sorted out. Before I talk about the homeward journey, one last thing, because it's a bit unfair. The nickname given to the Black Pig was for two reasons. A, she didn't go into St. Carlos, and B, and this is the most important point of the whole war, forget everything else, Canberra had run out of beer for the trip home. QE2 had hardly used any of hers. She had so much on board they could have steamed home on the beer. And a request went out for them to send over supplies to Canberra. And it was denied because Canberra was a different shipping line. Now, the ship doesn't deserve the nickname. It really doesn't. The ship was fine. It was the people actually running it and those that were in the boardroom back in the UK. They're the ones to blame, and they will have to live with it. The solution came from, I better not use his name, he's still alive, the Deputy Purser Catering in the Canberra. You know, the fellow that makes sure that all the nice passengers get plenty of booze and plenty of food and enjoy the trip. They anchored outside a port after leaving St. Carlos and going up the coast a bit at a town, and he went ashore with 2 command boats and a lot of fellows and found the local distributor of alcohol wholesale in the town, and he bought everything they had with a cheque. And of course, being in uniform with a lot of uniformed men around him and IDs, it was taken. I don't know how much it was. I really don't. But it would have probably been close to $100,000 worth, I would imagine. Maybe that was even in pounds. There was one problem, that he only had £7 10 shillings in his cheque account. So he had to fly back to the ship. They radioed London, and a courier from the London office raced to his bank and deposited a cheque for that amount so that it would be honoured when the time came. So the troops had, and the crew, had beer when they got home. They also had whiskey. They had, well, I think it was it. I think they only got beer and whiskey. So they had stuff to drink. And they got through quite a bit, believe me. Pictures of the Canberra coming home to Southampton. As you can see, she's a mess. But what a brave mess. I mean, that ship should have broken down long before it even reached UK. And it steamed thousands and thousands of miles after the patch was put on. I reckon that's pretty good. A lot of celebrations, of course, when the ship got back, but also behind the scenes there was an awful lot of funerals. That's always the way of war, isn't it? Celebrations, and then realisation of the truth sets in, and it's always followed by sadness. Still, stuff happens, doesn't it? I've included a picture of the gravestone of, I think it was Horace, Lieutenant Colonel Horace Jones. I can't remember, but anyway, it's Lieutenant Colonel Jones. He was the senior officer down there, and he was killed. He was 42 years old. It might have even gone on longer, but the fact that the Brits sent in a division of Gurkhas, and as soon as the Argentine troops, after many, many battles, many, many deaths, heard the Gurkhas were there, they pretty soon surrendered. Nobody wants to take on the Gurkhas. Nice chaps actually. I knew quite a few of them at home in England when the Royal Tournament was on, because my father was British Army in India and worked with Gurkhas, and they used to stay at our place when the Royal Tournament was on. I've added one last photograph. It's the Canberra, run ashore on the mud flats at the breakers yard, halfway through being broken up. Silly, isn't it? All the achievements, let's call it a lifetime, of the ship. All the highs, all the lows, all the medals, all the accolades, all the, I suppose you could say, love. It always ends up in a breakers yard somewhere, doesn't it? With nobody caring whether you're a ship, an aeroplane, or a human being. Now, I don't want to get too morbid now. That's not me, that's the stuff. There's a warning on some of the drugs I'm taking. They can make you melancholy. Why don't they just say sad? No, melancholy. Putting everything aside, this war and the outcome comes down to two very basic elements. One, a grand lady of the sea by the name of Canberra, who against all odds and potential massive engine failure got herself from Australia to England and down to the Falkland Isles and all the way back again. The other one, another great lady, whether you love her or hate her, Maggie Thatcher won this war. Yes, I know, the troops and the guns and tanks, but she won it. She did that because in this day and age, if anybody gets attacked, the usual outcome is for talks to start, and these go on and on and on, and they can sit around tables for years, like the Vietnam War, like the Korean War. But this time, somebody just said, bugger the talking, let's get going. So here's just a couple of photos of Maggie with her troops. She was very quick to get ashore down there once the fighting was just about all over. And the other photo of her in the defiant tone of, well, if anybody gets in the way, I'll sort them out. And she's in command of a Challenger tank, and you wouldn't want to cross Maggie and a Challenger tank. So that has to be there, because without those two elements, Canberra, Maggie Thatcher, it would have all been over very quickly. One last picture that I thought I'd throw in, because when I said I was going to do this, somebody said, well, aren't you afraid you might step on a few toes? Especially the fact that not everything's been known. And the truth of the matter is, no. There's a picture of me right after the end. How it ends, irrelevant, because a lot of people will remember it. I'll see you when I get home. I'm due for a short break of about a week and a half before the last lot and the next lot, so when I get there I can do a proper one. Cheers, my friends.